This is Just Something About Her, a podcast from The Recount and iHeartRadio.
There's this issue of how easy it is to vilify women and to just say, like, hey, just look at her. There's just something about her that she must be guilty.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Palmieri. On this podcast, I talk to powerful women about how they made it to the top on their own terms. This week's guest, journalist and activist Amanda Knox. Amanda Knox, it is delightful to see you and really great to have you on Just Something About Her. So the podcast is called Just Something About Her. And in my head, because I had worked for Hillary Clinton, I had her in my mind. There's just something about her I don't like, I don't trust. But it could easily have been said about you. This podcast could easily be
it has been said about me.
Yeah, Hillary is the OG of this. But I was like, really? Really, it is just, there was just something about you that was different from how people expected a woman to behave that I think put us on this cataclysmic path. But tell us your version of your story. Let's start with that.
Sure. So I guess my version of my story starts with something tragic that happened out of nowhere. I was living abroad with a British exchange student, Meredith Kircher, and one night, out of the blue, Meredith just happened to be home alone, and a local burglar named Rudy Gaudet, who had been on a burglarizing spree for the past several weeks, broke into our house and raped and murdered her, and then fled the country. And I came home to a crime scene, and I showed up at the police station diligently. I was interrogated for 53 hours over 4 days until eventually overnight they lied to me, they screamed at me, they hit me, and they eventually forced me to sign statements that they wrote implicating myself, my boyfriend at the time, and my boss. I immediately recanted those statements, but I was imprisoned anyway. And eventually what happened was the police finally brought in all of the forensics. They found the fingerprints, they found the blood stains and everything, and all of it pointed to this figure, Rudy Gaudet. And yet, instead of admitting that they had arrested the wrong people, they just altered their theory of the crime to have it be me orchestrating a sex death orgy and basically having these males in my life rape and kill my roommate for me.
Italians are calling this the trial of the decade.
You're talking about it. Everyone is talking about it.
Sex.
A
drug-fueled sex game.
Drug-fueled sex game.
A drug-fueled sex game gone wrong.
It was a incredibly sensational story that was not based in any fact whatsoever, but it captivated people's imaginations, and it was really pushing forward this prosecution for years. So, it's a long, convoluted story, but it's also not really all that different from any kind of wrongful conviction. It's just prosecutorial tunnel vision. There's ego and reputation at play. And then there's this issue of how easy it is to vilify women and to just say, like, hey, just look at her. There's just something about her that she must be guilty. We'll just figure out how.
Was it a combination of all these things, the ego of the police and the prosecutors, or just a sense? I watched the documentary that you participated in that's on Netflix, where they interview the investigators, prosecutors, and wow, they just can't let it go to this day.
I don't want to speculate about exactly what the reasons are, but I do know that it is very, very human to have very specific cognitive biases. And I also think it's very, very human to think, well, if I have good intentions and I have a feeling about a certain thing, then I must be right.
Yes.
And if I have good intentions, I couldn't be wrong. I couldn't be pursuing, I'm not trying to put an innocent person in jail. So I couldn't possibly be the kind of person who would do that. And I think that is one of the big factors in this case of the police not admitting fault, is because they don't want to see themselves as the kind of people who would make that kind of mistake.
Some of the American interviews.
Oh, yeah.
Chris Cuomo? Wow.
Were you into deviant sex? Insensitive question, but hey, we got to get to what it is. This fuels the doubt.
Yeah, to be fair to Chris Cuomo, like he sort of warned me going into it, like, hey, I'm going to be hard on you because I'm going to be like...
No.
Okay.
Like, that's not fair. It's not fair. It's not fair. It's bullshit to say off camera, be all nice and say, oh, hey, I'm going to be tough on you.
Yeah.
And like buy into all of the bullshit tropes. And it wasn't just Chris Cuomo. I will fix this if it's not right. It was Diane
Sawyer? Yeah.
How high were you?
Why did you talk to them? Why did you talk to the American press?
I was trying to be heard. And what I discovered was that I'm walking into a conversation where this is not a conversation at all. This is a story that has been pre-scripted by this person who is sitting in front of me, who knows exactly what questions they're going to ask me and knows exactly what story they want to tell before they've even talked to me. And I am, as the person sitting across from them, I'm not another person. I'm just, again, another character in this story that they are telling. In most people's minds, I'm considered a character, as something in the zeitgeist that is that we can point to, that people recognize, but they forget that there's a human being behind it.
So we're talking about Stillwater, which is the new movie, for those who don't know, it's a new movie of Matt Damon's, director of the film was Tom McCarthy. He is the father of a daughter who is being held abroad for a murder that, and they're telling she was involved with but did not commit.
You're the father of the girl, the American student?
Yes, ma'am.
And Tom McCarthy said he was inspired by your case, but took it was a new direction, a new imagining.
You know, I was pretty fascinated with the Amanda Knox case. It was really just served as inspiration at that point.
But it's actually not a new imagining. It is sort of different circumstances, but the story that they tell is what you might refer to as the doppelganger version of your story, right?
Yeah.
The story that's like...
the mythology version of the story. If he were to say, like, oh, we're taking the Amanda Knox case as our premise and then we're bringing it into a new direction, what I think he's referring to is the fact that the Amanda Knox father character is going to be investigating and searching for the killer. And sure, that's a new direction. But what's not a new direction is the premise of the Amanda Knox person being involved and at the very least indirectly responsible and also sexually involved with the Meredith Kercher character. And that's where I took issue with the fictionalization of my story, because he didn't fictionalize that at all. He took the fiction that was already in existence that continues to be a burden and a obstacle in my ability to reintegrate successfully into the real world.
The thing that strikes me, Matt Damon is a male actor who tells stories about men, women actors tell stories about women. But what I have to say is particularly galling is, lifts the myth of your story, not to tell the story of a woman like you, but to tell the story of a man.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, I wasn't totally offended by that, because I do think that my dad's experience of my wrongful conviction is an incredibly harrowing experience and a worthwhile one to tell. And I'm honestly not surprised that Tom McCarthy and Matt Damon were thinking along those terms, because that is their immediate source of empathy. They're thinking, oh, as the father of someone like that, what would I do? And how would I be even more badass than the real life version?
I'm trying to get my little girl out of jail. That's all I give a damn about.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised that he went out of his way to go to Oklahoma and talk to a bunch of people in Oklahoma to better represent them as characters.
I'm pulling up your tweet about that. The cherry on top of this hashtag Stillwater thing. Damon McCarthy spent time with and developed empathy for, quote, Oklahoma roughnecks, but didn't think to extend that same effort and empathy to the wrongfully vilified woman they use as a plot device.
Right. And I think that is ultimately the problem that I have, where it's like, okay, you thought to do all that effort and extend that empathy to the real people that you are going to be representing, knowing that there were going to be potential consequences to that representation. If you don't do it well, they're not going to feel represented. Well,
and that's a good thing to do. It's a good thing that they have done that.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. I think that's a great job. I just wish that courtesy had also been extended to myself, because there is so much judgment that is already a part of that story. The whole premise of the story is one of judgment over the female character. And not giving me the opportunity to vocalize to them, like, hey, there are consequences to the representation of this female character in this story, is a little bit an oversight on their part, I would say.
There's judgment, and then also it seems from the way the plot has been written about, like that the daughter is also hiding something, right? There's something suspicious or something about her. She's still right.
There's something about her.
Yes. Now, so you wrote this great piece in the Atlantic.
Thank you.
It was really well done, really well done. So explain to us the process. You heard about the movie, you wrote this thread, the Atlantic got in touch. How did it all come down? What were you feeling along the way?
Well, I found out about the film because the trailer came out. I just saw the trailer. I saw the very, very clear parallels to my case. I saw the headline saying this new, Amanda Knox inspired story is coming out. And my first reaction was, well, again, like, okay, here's another one, because this is not the first time this has happened. And, to Tom McCarthy's credit, he was not the person who invented, taking someone else's story and going with it without considering that maybe their consent should or could be a part of the development process of a creative piece. And then I did some investigating to find out how it was that they actually, fictionalized this story. Mm-hmm. And I was disappointed to find that it was not as responsible as I would have hoped, and that it was, in fact, further entrenching these very, very harmful myths about the case. And for this big, like, someone who has as much resources and reach as Matt Damon and Tom McCarthy to be reiterating that same problematic mythology without consideration of the consequences to me is, I think, an issue that is not just a problem for me. It's an issue that has to go towards who is allowed to tell a story. Right. Why them? And why do they get the resources to tell a story? And should they be asking themselves, well, who has the most at stake when I tell this story? And why am I telling the story the way that I am? And should I consider reaching out to others who could give me insight on how I could tell this story more responsibly? And the way that this story presents it is that, yes, she had special knowledge. Yes, she was the one who incentivized it. And so, yes, she was, even if she didn't mean to and she's technically innocent, she's definitely indirectly responsible for her roommate's death.
She instigated it. She instigated the events that led to the murder.
Yeah. And that's the false narrative that is, like, that's in the ether of people's minds when they think about this case, where it's like,
yes, mm-hmm.
I wish that people understood and talked about this case and used the appropriate words to talk about this case that actually represent reality. This is the murder of Meredith Kercher by Rudy Gaudet. And Amanda Knox has nothing to do with that.
I would think they would at least be concerned about what your reaction might be. Right? Like, it's just like, I was like, even if you're just trying to protect yourselves, would you not reach out to Amanda Knox in 2021 America?
Well, and that's the major reason why I decided to speak up about it, because I genuinely do not think that Tom McCarthy and Matt Damon had bad intentions. But one, their sort of assumption about what the case was even about was false, that it's not the story of a American girl involved in a crime, but one in which she was accused of being involved, but not actually being involved. And also there's the issue of, like, if they had reached out to me to ask me how I felt about the way that they were portraying me, they would have learned a lot. And I think that problem is that in most people's minds, I'm considered a character. I am the case, and people's idea of me, they've seen in the context of it being a story, a plot device, as something in the zeitgeist that is that we can point to, that people recognize, but they forget that there's a human being behind it. What they've done is they've said, okay, my audience is going to recognize this story and they're going to recognize this character. They're thinking about their audience. They're not thinking about the human being who is the source material of that character. And why is that? Well, they're not in a position where they're forced to have to consider that. In the same way that we're finally having some sense of accountability for the way that certain characters are portrayed in these stories, and acknowledging that in the past, when we have told the stories of people who are in underprivileged positions, who are not being empowered to write their own narratives and be the authors of their own experiences, we've made mistakes. We've overlooked people's humanity in a big way, and it's come at the expense of great groups of people. We have yet to sort of have that same, to recognize that same thing is happening on an individual level as well, when those individuals have become, once again, stereotypes in the ether and, touchstones in the zeitgeist, but are not recognized as human beings who have perspective and can be the authors of their own experience if only we would empower them to do that. I had a choice when I came out. I could either try to disappear, or I could try to turn this lens upon itself.
How would you wished it was handled? That they had reached out to you and said, we plan to do this. We want to talk to your dad. We want to talk to you.
If they had said, hey, we really want to tell this story. We want to tell it right. We understand that people are going to recognize you in our portrayal. Can we talk about that so that our portrayal is not going to come at your expense? That would have been an acknowledgement. What's sort of curious to me is it's not like I disappeared into the ether and I became this person who was off the grid and no one could reach out to me. I've actually been quite vocal about how my story has been stolen and how women's stories have been stolen, and how women in particular have been sold as cardboard characters in morality plays that other people are designing and profiting off of.
Would you welcome a movie about yourself? Do you want to do that?
I would definitely be open to talking to partners about that. It's because it is such an interesting story to be
what would we
someone...
learn from that? What would you want people to know from that?
Well, one, that anyone is this can happen to anyone. I came from a world where the criminal justice system was such a foreign entity to me. It was something else it was a thing that had to do with bad people, and it had nothing to do with me, so I never had to think about it. And having gone through the system myself and becoming exposed to people who had done horrible things and had made mistakes, and yet recognizing their humanity by living side by side with them for years at a time, realizing that their mistakes are in the context of a society that is not supporting a lot of people to be their best selves and to have good choices to make in any given moment. That was a huge revelation, that we are all sort of implicated in the crimes and the things that happen in our society. We all have a stake in it, so we should all be a participant in it. It makes me feel like I am very often a bridge between very different worlds, where people who have been disenfranchised and taken advantage of and churned through the criminal justice system, people who don't usually look like me, are the people who I actually have most in common with.
As we're talking about this, I'll note that Black people are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted than white people. The biases and prejudice against Black men in the criminal justice system they're different from what you're experienced. And the problem for them can often be they're not thrust their case is not thrust into the spotlight, right?
They're swept under the rug. They also are victims of stereotypes where there's just this figure of the criminal black man that is, that lens is just cast upon them and colors everything about the evidence in their case. And prosecutors are able to cast that lens with impunity. I think the thing that sort of occurs to me is it is a tragedy that those stories are swept under the rug and those lives are swept under the rug and often forgotten. There's no mistake that it took 10 times as long to get a lot of black men out of prison than it took to get me out of prison. I never asked for the spotlight, right? Like, if anything, the spotlight was thrust upon me by really unscrupulous police and media. And what I had a choice when I came out. I could either try to disappear or I could try to turn this lens upon itself and say, not only am I going to redefine this narrative that has been written about me, but I'm also going to inform you in the process of how this narrative is being rewritten in other individual lives over and over and over again, especially as storytellers. Like, I've been, calling out the media and calling out the criminal justice system for a long time, but also I want to call out creatives. I want to call out storytellers, people who feel like they're safe behind the inspired by and fictionalized. Like they feel like they're at a safe distance when they're telling these stories, but they're not, because that safety is not extended to me. Like I am still bearing a cost by how they decide to tell a story that is inspired by my story.
Tell us about the kind of work that you're doing on behalf of those who are who have been wrongfully convicted, and where are good sources of information for people to learn more about it.
Absolutely. So, of course, the Innocence Project, there's a misunderstanding that the Innocence Project represents everything that happens in the United States. The original Innocence Project is based in New York. And every state in the country actually has its own Innocence Project or Innocence Project-like project. Like they're not all called the Innocence Project. All of these groups are incredibly important, and I always try to point people in their direction because there are a million ways that you can support them. You can support them financially, but you could also support them by spreading the word about, like, one of the things I would love people to be more aware of is when you are a jury member, inform yourself going into that experience of what constitutes good evidence and not good evidence, what constitutes bias in terms of, witness tampering and interrogation techniques. Like, all of these things come into play, and we could all be better informed.
Advice. That is great, practical, actionable advice that would make a huge difference.
I'm also on the board of the Frederick Douglass Project for Justice, which basically is trying to put people who are not in prison in direct communication and direct contact with people who are in prison, whether they are guilty or not. And that is because there's also a lot of damage occurs on the societal level when we feel like we're just really fundamentally different kinds of people, the people who stay out of prison and the people who end up in prison. And really, we need to make those human connections more so we can better understand what leads people to commit the crimes that bring them into prison in the first place, and how can we all be better connected and better supported so that we can have a safer society for everyone.
And I think particularly with the criminal justice system, there's a sense, it's like one thing that we can be certain of, like, oh, that person was convicted, therefore they definitely did it. And it goes through this process, but you don't appreciate how all of these things, the bias in the media and the bias in, political bias in terms of how we view people, bias in the system and, bias in the courtroom, all plays into this. I've listened to some of Labyrinth, and it's really great. I'll say that you walk the walk in terms of reaching out to people who you're going to talk about, because Malcolm Gladwell had a chapter about you in a book, and you and your husband interviewed him for the podcast. Woody, it's called Labyrinth. Explain it. Tell us what you feel like, some of the things that you've learned from it.
You don't have to be wrongly convicted to understand what it feels like to be wrongly convicted. These are all experiences where, and I'm interested in all these experiences where people have things happen to them that are out of their control, that they feel like they have lost their sense of agency and voice in the process of this thing happening to them. And how do you navigate that experience when the thing that you are experiencing is so overwhelming and so much bigger than you? How do you navigate that? And sometimes there aren't happy endings to these stories. And the agency that person who was stripped of their agency, the only thing that they have left is how do they existentially and mentally and psychologically understand and draw meaning from their experience. That is interesting to me because it doesn't matter what the story is. What matters is what is happening on the human level inside of you as you are processing this thing that is happening to you. These are the stories that I'm really interested in telling. I want to give you a voice. That matters. It matters to be given a voice. It matters because you are the one who has the most at stake in this story, and you should be allowed to tell it.
There's just so much here, Amanda, that I think can help a lot of people. So, I just keep doing what you're doing.
All right. Well, thank you.